Imagine waking up one morning to find out that the farmland you've owned for 3 generations is no longer yours. This was precisely the silent yet profound pain of the farmer bankruptcies that ravaged the heartland of America in the 1980s. Not all at once, but cumulative, suffocating and gnawing at one's soul. Americans who lived through those years still say, "We didn't lose the farm, we lost ourselves with the farm." In the old America, farming wasn't just a job. It was a legacy of a family name, it was a pride, it was a way of life. But the economic upheaval of the early 1980s became an invisible storm that shattered that pride. It all started as a seemingly minor detail, a sudden rise in interest rates, banks demanding collateral, driving fuel prices, dropping grain prices, and most importantly, no one could see where this chain would lead. In those years, the fields of Central America looked cold, even under the winter sun. Because it wasn't just corn growing in those fields, uncertainty was also growing. A Nebraska farmer recounted this years later. "I would go to the barn in the mornings, but I couldn't look the animals in the eye. I had taken out a loan to care for them. I had to work harder to pay off that loan, but the more I worked, the more debt I got into." These words showed that the so-called farm crisis wasn't just an economic problem, it was a desperation that gnawed at the heart. The kind that leaves one speechless. Some farmers, unable to refuel their tractors, would park them behind barns and cover them with tarpaulins. Families, unable to repay their loans, would inform their neighbors before the banker knocked on their door, saying, "Don't let the children be afraid." And do you know what was truly troubling? The fields weren't sitting idle, the soil wasn't losing its fertility, but their owners were gradually being forced to give up their lives. The most striking aspect was this devastation was barely visible to millions of people living in cities. It was briefly reported on television news, then it passed by. But on the edges of the fields, inside the barns, in the kitchens of the farmhouses, there was a true silence, and within this silence, the footsteps of the approaching storm could be heard. At first, people thought it was a temporary hardship. Then he said, "If we borrow a little more, we'll recover." Then he said, "If we wait a little longer, prices will improve." But as the pace slowed, so did hope. That dry, grey wind of the 1980s wasn't just drying up the crops, it was also drying up the spirit of the villages. Thus, the most selfless people of old America began to become the most forgotten. They labored on the same land, yet fell into the same pain. And it was at this very point that the hidden face of the silent collapse began to slowly emerge. Because this crisis wasn't just a debt crisis, it was one of the deepest wounds in the heart of America. Now we'll continue from here, but remember, the real collapse begins, the place I haven't yet described. The wind that blew across Central America in the early 1980s was no ordinary economic breeze. It smelled of panic, of loss, of the tension of an approaching storm. Old farmers who remember those years still say, "The tractor wheels were turning, but our lives seemed frozen." The crisis didn't suddenly erupt one morning. On the contrary, it came step by step. With each step, it invisibly grew a little heavier. The first rupture on a farm usually began like this: a letter from the bank, a short, formal, cold letter. That letter, beginning, due to changes in interest rates, was the first sign of the storm that would tear a family from their land for 3 generations. In old America, debt was not a source of shame. For farmers, debt was even a promise of investment. A new tractor, larger fields, more crops, it was part of a belief in the future. But by 1980, those debts had become a burden, not a hope. As interest rates rose, farmers could no longer grow crops, no matter how hard they worked. Some families even signed mortgage agreements rather than selling the grain on their fields to pay the interest. This agreement often served as a deadlock. It was then that village roads began to seem quieter. The sounds of tractors faded. Farmyards where children played became deserted. Many farmhouses lost their porches because of the electricity bill. A farmer's wife in Minnesota recalled years later, "My husband wouldn't look at me, not because he felt guilty, but because he was tired. We stopped talking to each other during dinner. It was as if every word brought on more debt." This psychological pressure was the most invisible yet painful aspect of the crisis. People living in the heart of America's food production felt like the country's most forgotten people. City life continued to unfold on television, but in the countryside, time moved in slow motion. When November arrived on a farm, everything was darker. The fields were bare, the ground cold, the air dry. But farmers knew that the real winter wasn't on the ground, but within it. One of the most dramatic scenes during this period was this. Families were selling everything they owned, trying to pay off the debt. Cows, tractors, harvesters. All the hard work of a farm was lost in a few minutes, appraised in front of a few bankers. Most children remember this scene. Their father would caress the seat of his tractor and look at it as if he were riding it one last time. Watching a tractor leave was often the same as seeing the soul of a house leave, and the most painful aspect of this process was this. The soil was still, the crop was growing, but the farmer couldn't. At this point it would become clear why the crisis was deepening, because this wasn't just the breaking of economic chains, this was the invisibility of America's most productive hands. Before everything escalated further, a development that would determine the future of farms appeared on the horizon. It was approaching, it could be felt, but no one could name it. In the next section, I will explain why this invisible pressure became so dangerous, and that section will be the clearest look yet at the heart of the crisis. The sun was still rising that morning, but nothing was the same for the farmers. Banks sent lien papers to hundreds of fields before anyone had even finished breakfast. And the most painful part was this. These people hadn't defaulted on their debts. The debt had been made unpayable overnight. But what was truly shocking was the claim that these bankruptcies weren't accidents. Many farmers believed that the rates had been deliberately inflated, that interest rates had been deliberately stiffened, and that's when everything changed. American farmers were experiencing their best years in history in the late 1970s. Grain prices were high, the world was buying from America, and banks were offering easy loans. A farmer had to be hopeful because the harvest meant next year could be better. But that fear, which everyone can experience, it strikes at the very moment when hope is most vulnerable. One morning, the radio broadcast, "Interest rates have been raised again today." No one panicked. Not in the first week, not in the second, but as the months went by, interest rates climbed from 10% to 15%, then to 18%, then, hard to believe, over 20%. This wasn't just bad for borrowers, it meant farms are being systematically strangled. Every paragraph, every update, every bank statement, it was another stab in the farmers' hearts. In those years, Washington was broadcasting messages of hope on television, but even the sound of tractors in the Midwest had changed. The engine was running, but it wouldn't move forward, just like the lives of farmers. Because what was truly shocking, this crisis turned not only into an economic collapse, but also a societal collapse. As for sale signs invaded towns, people averted their eyes in shame. America's proudest people, hard-working farmers, now they were being auctioned off in front of their own homes. A father, looking at the shade of the trees he had planted 30 years earlier, said, "What have I done to deserve this?" But the truly tragic part, there was never an answer to this question, because what was being sold wasn't just the tractor, the barn, or the seeds. A family history, a lifestyle, a generation's hope, all could be destroyed on the same day, and through it all, the bank's response was always the same. These are the rules. In the winter of 1985, hundreds of farmers from across America piled into their tractors and headed toward Washington. Snowfall, icy roads, frozen fuel lines, nothing could stop them because they had nothing left to lose. This scene wasn't a movie, it was real. The giant tractors lined up in front of the White House like a silent army. They weren't strong, but their desperation made them appear strong. The intriguing thing was this. Washington couldn't ignore these protests, but supporting them could also trigger other crises. Could America's agricultural heart keep beating, or was this march a last gasp of despair? The crisis devastated not just farmers but entire towns. When the nearby market closed, when the diesel station closed, when the school budget was cut, A town wasn't officially disappearing, but it was practically collapsing. The following words from a teacher deeply touched many. "Every child in my class lost something from their family. Some lost their cows, some their fields, some their fathers. But what was truly shocking, the fact that so much suffering was barely visible in the national media. The farmer crisis was silent. It was all the more dangerous because it was silent. Food producers, the pillars of society, were unable to provide for themselves. And worse, no one knew the full extent of this. Now the real question is this. As the crisis reached its boiling point, America made an unexpected decision that changed the entire course of events. But how? And was this decision truly a solution, or the beginning of something bigger? By the mid-1980s, everyone in America was whispering the same question. If this country can't even save its own farmers, what can it save? Towns were collapsing, fields were lying empty, auction trucks were driving through the streets. Things had gotten so bad, many farming families had become afraid of the envelopes that arrived in their mailboxes, because most of those envelopes began with a cold bank statement, payment not received, property is foreclosed. America's heart was bleeding, and it was no longer possible to ignore this wound. In 1985, something happened, something no one expected. A group of musicians, Willie Nelson, Neil Young, John Mellencamp, took the stage and uttered a single sentence: "If farmers die, America dies." This sentence sent a seismic wave across the country. The concert wasn't just music, it was a mirror that showed millions of Americans the pain farmers were experiencing for the first time. Television channels broadcast empty barns, shuttered towns, and families tearfully selling their tractors. And you know what was truly shocking? For the first time, the public showed such strong support for farmers who had been ignored for so long. Farm aid didn't just raise money, it awakened America's conscience. This was the true turning point in the crisis. As public pressure grew, policy began to shift. Washington finally realized this crisis isn't just a farmer's crisis, it's a food security crisis. The new agricultural laws enacted after 1985 opened the door to be-afflicted restructuring, low-interest farm loans, agricultural support programs, giving bankrupt families a second chance. But is everything solved? Of course not. The real question at this point is, did these laws actually save farmers, or did they merely slow the pace of decline? The truth is, many families didn't lose their land thanks to these subsidies, but just as many had already lost it. America's agricultural backbone recovered, but it never fully returned to its former strength. Yet one fact remains. Had these regulations not been enacted, the United States would be facing a much darker picture today. The 1985 farm crisis is still talked about today, because this period reminded America of an unforgettable truth. He who loses land loses his future. And when the quietest people in society, farmers, are one day forced to raise their voices, this is not just an economic cry, it is a cry for survival. This crisis fractured America, but it also reshaped it. Towns didn't remain the same. Generations abandoned their professions. Agriculture modernized but lost its soul. People began to understand the invisible labor behind food, and most importantly, the pain of this period created a new consciousness that said, never again. The farm crisis ended, laws changed, some families got back on their feet, but a silent truth remained. Sometimes it's not skyscrapers that make a country strong, but a family working a small field. That's precisely why this story is remembered, because everything a farmer loses is a part of a nation lost. And America realized this too late, because when the land's voice is silenced, a country's future is also silenced. And remember, every economic crisis shakes not a picture, but the lives of real people. That's why the farm crisis is not just a historical event. It is a lesson to be learned, a memory to be preserved. America fell and broke in those years, but it learned to rise again, albeit at a heavy price. And when we look back today, those years have taught us only one thing: those who protect the land protect the future. And that crisis taught us this: when a nation loses its land, it loses not only its crops but also its hope for its own future. Thanks for listening. See you in the next video.